Congress has passed a budget resolution to advance the Trump agenda, but does it still spend too much money? Texas Congressman Chip Roy is at the top of the show to explain. Plus, DOJ keeps cutting as 21 technologists quit rather than see the federal government go through some necessary shrinkage. Oversight Chairman James Comer will react in moments, plus the latest on President Trump's moves for peace in Ukraine and the latest Bezos edict to de-wokeify the Washington Post. All next on the Matt Gaetz Show. Let's do this. We're shaking up Washington, D.C. We're breaking the fever.
You ever watch this guy on television? It's like a machine. He's great. Matt Gaetz.
After rounds of wrangling and negotiation, the House of Representatives passed a budget resolution last evening. Some are glad progress toward the Trump agenda is moving forward. It's an agenda that has achieved broad popularity in opening months, as White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt noted from the briefing room.
Nearly every one of President Trump's policy initiatives are receiving strong majority support. And I have noted that in every briefing since Inauguration Day. 81% of Americans support deporting illegal migrant criminals from our nation's interior. 76% of Americans support the DOJ-led efforts of a full-scale investigation to find and eliminate fraud and waste in government expenditures. Again, this is from a Harvard-Harris poll, a very legitimate pollster. 76% of Americans support closing the border. 69% of Americans support President Trump's common sense efforts to ban men from women's sports. As you all know, we celebrated that executive order at the White House a couple of weeks ago. 65% of Americans support the president's efforts to eliminate all preferences by race in the hiring and awarding of government contracts, which is another pledge that DOJ is working hard to fulfill. And 61% of Americans, vast majority, support the president's plan for reciprocal tariffs to ensure that other countries are treating us the way we have always been treated. Despite what many Democrats and media members want you to believe, the Trump agenda is not only necessary, but it is overwhelmingly popular. Why? Because it's driven by common sense.
But is Congress doing enough to support the Trump DOJ spending cuts? Some have their doubts. Social media users are observing that the plan has massive spending hikes and tiny spending cuts. No less than Elon Musk replied, "This sounds problematic," and that's because it is. Democrat Congressman Ro Khanna got in on the troll, posting, quote, "I'm curious how the budget House Republicans passed last night, which adds $100 billion in defense spending and $2.8 trillion to the deficit over 10 years, align with Elon Musk and DOJ's goals, or SecDef's call for an 8% DOD cut." It's a fair question, because the national debt is completely out of control. Imagine a credit card bill so big it has 14 digits before even getting to the decimal point. That's the national debt, currently over $36 trillion. To put it in perspective, that's over $100,000 per American. And this colossal IOU didn't appear overnight. It's the result of years of Washington spending far more than it takes in, like a shopaholic with an unlimited credit card line. The national debt isn't just an abstract number. It's a greedy shadow looming over our entire economy. As the debt soars, interest payments also balloon, eating up funds that could be used to fix roads or help educate students. In fact, the United States spent about $892 billion just on interest for the national debt in 2024. That's more than we spend on national defense. Elon Musk made this point just today in President Trump's first cabinet meeting. He warned that the United States is on the verge of bankruptcy.
The overall goal here with the DOJ team is to help address the enormous deficit. We simply cannot sustain as a country $2 trillion deficits. The interest rates, just the interest on the national debt, now exceeds the Defense Department spending. We spend a lot on the Defense Department, but we're spending like over $1 trillion on interest. If this continues, the country will become de facto bankrupt. It's not an optional thing, it is an essential thing.
High debt also threatens to slow down the economy over time. Experts warn that beyond a certain tipping point, too much debt can drag economic growth. It can spook investment. It's like trying to run a marathon with a piano on your back. You can go at it pretty hard, but sooner or later, you're not going to be able to move very fast. So you may figure, all right, the country has a big credit card bill, but so does my neighbor. What does that have to do with me? Unfortunately, when it's the nation, a lot. For one, heavy governmental debt can raise the cost of living for everyone. We've already seen how it can stoke inflation, meaning that your dollar buys less for your family. Globally, a debt-laden America is kind of like a superhero with a major weakness. Sure, we can make a lot of things happen, but we all know how this ends if debt becomes America's kryptonite. Superpowers with debt to GDP ratio around 100% typically fail. Burgeoning debt can also act as a brake on the economy. Government borrowing can crowd out private investment, meaning fewer jobs, weaker wage growth over time. And if confidence in the United States ever fails or crumbles, even just like a little bit, you could see a debt crisis trigger a severe cascading collapse. Think massive layoffs and market chaos. In short, the national debt has ways of making everyone's life harder now and in the future. COVID spending policies, President Biden's enormous spending bills, and the forever wars of the Bush-Obama years have all contributed substantially to these debts. It's a bipartisan failure, no doubt. There are some in Congress fighting back against the big spending, the costly wars, and the dumb decisions. Congressman Chip Roy of Texas has been a stalwart against these things. He's introduced legislation to repeal the 1991 and 2002 authorizations to use military force in Iraq, which seems very reasonable to us. He's also been a key player in the budget negotiations and has been pushing for deeper cuts. Thanks so much for joining me, Congressman Roy. First, tell me all about your legislation to repeal the Iraq war authorizations to use military force and who you're working with on it.
Yeah, great to be on the show, Matt. I mean, we're moving forward with legislation that I know you're intimately familiar with from your time in service in Congress, which is just a pretty simple statement, right? Which is we are now 20 years removed from Saddam Hussein being deposed, and we still have on the books an authorization of the use of military force to be at war with Iraq. Now, that seems to me to be counter to our principles and what the Constitution stands for in Congress declaring war, to just leave this in place in perpetuity. Endless wars, perpetual wars, that's what gotten us into trouble, both in terms of blood and treasure and the spending, but also getting our military focused away from where it should be, which is peace through strength, which is where President Trump wants to take it rightly with Pete Hegseth. So I think this is a no-brainer. Repeal these. We still have the authority to go deal with terrorists, but we ought to get rid of these old AUMFs. They shouldn't be on the books.
Whenever we would try to get a vote on these matters in the Foreign Affairs Committee, Chairman McCall would usually oppose them and say that they weren't going to receive that type of consideration. There's a new chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee now. It's Congressman Brian Mast. Have you talked to Chairman Mast about moving this forward? And if not, who are the members of Congress who still think we need to be at war with Saddam Hussein?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how many would actually admit to that or acknowledge that they think we should still be at war, but there are some great members of Congress who share my view on this, guys like Warren Davidson, others that I won't go name by name, but who get why this is important. I have mentioned this to new chairman Brian Mast. He's a great guy. We've worked together on some Israel issues, sanctioning the International Criminal Court, for example. But Brian and I still need to sit down and talk about where we go in terms of doing this. Obviously, we want to be respectful of the administration and work with them and how we do this, but we think it's important from an Article 1 standpoint to get it done. So we'll keep having that conversation. Hopefully this Congress, we can do it. We came close to having a deal last Congress to getting it done, but we kind of hit a wall and weren't able to get it done. So hopefully we can do it now.
Yeah, Godspeed on that project. Now, the House has passed the Senate budget resolution. It adds a lot to the debt. And I know behind those closed doors, you are fighting as hard as anyone for every spending cut we can get. But explain to my audience how hard it is to get Republicans in Congress to back major programmatic spending cuts.
Yeah, well, look, the DNA in this town is to just keep spending money that we don't have, right? It's really easy to spend other people's money. People in Congress are good at it. They listen to the lobby, they do what they're told, and they just go, look, we're going to buy off our votes. You know, I believe that we should be in the position of actually honoring our commitment to reduce spending and balance the budget. All these guys in Coke campaign on, pass a balanced budget amendment, but that's a shiny object. It's fake. When it comes down to it, just honor your commitment now and reduce spending, but they won't do it. So what we did with the budget resolution this week, we passed one last night. As you would expect, I voted for it with strong reservations. Why? It doesn't reduce spending nearly enough. I think we should go a lot farther. I did vote for it because it does open the door to dealing with what we need to deal with mandatory spending. I know there's some concerns about it with the president. I know there's some concerns about it with some of my colleagues. We can and must reform Medicaid. It's a scam in many respects being used to enrich hospitals and big blue states using federal match rates for able-bodied and illegals to fatten their pockets. And so then the people who are the most vulnerable are left on the sidelines. We should fix that. We can save hundreds of billions of dollars if we do that. So this bill opens that door. Jody Arrington deserves credit. We were actually able to put spending reductions of about $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion to go along with the tax cuts. And for the first time, we married tax cut increases with spending cuts. And that's important to change the game in this town. Now, it's in the Senate. And you know what they'll do? They'll try to one-way ratchet just the tax cuts. And look, and Matt, let's be clear. I am for making tax cuts permanent. I'm for as many tax cuts as we can do. But I want them married to spending cuts. Otherwise, the deficits are going to go up.
President Trump and Secretary Hegseth have talked about ambitious cuts at the Pentagon, but you and I both know the defense hawks have really bristled at that. Do you think that spending at the Pentagon has any chance of getting cut during the Trump presidency?
Well, it certainly should, and I'm a big fan of Pete Hegseth, and I think he said a lot of good things about what needs to be done over there, finding the waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon, of which there is much out of their $900 billion roughly budget. They should take some of those things, find it, and use that for troop pay and for assets. But look, we were asked to include $100 billion of additional defense money in this reconciliation budget. Now, we haven't done the package yet, but that $100 billion, they're not going to get their cake and eat it too. I'm not giving them $100 billion over here if they're not going to go over in the appropriations ledger and hold that spending flat. We need to freeze discretionary spending, our regular appropriations, our annual appropriations at 24 levels for 25, 6, 7, 8 for the presidency. Use DOGE to find savings. Use DOGE to do what we need to do because they're finding great waste, fraud, and abuse. And on the mandatory side with reconciliation, we should do what we're supposed to do to make sure that it reconciles and we're not increasing the deficit. The Pentagon needs to have waste cut just as much as anywhere else. I hope Hegseth and the president will be able to do that.
You've mentioned DOGE. Elon Musk is posting on X his frustration with these single judges in a single jurisdiction issuing nationwide injunctions. Are we going to come to the point where this administration is going to ignore some of those nationwide injunctions, do you think?
Well, we'll certainly see. I mean, right, we've got judges, and this is now an age-old problem. And look, it's been used against us a lot. And remember, we were getting some of those out of favorable jurisdictions, notably the Northern District of Texas, where we were getting some of those nationwide injunctions against Biden. But should we clean that system up? Sure. I think Mike Lee's got a great proposal that would say these things got to go to a 3-judge panel. You can't have a single judge that just goes and issues these opinions. And in the absence of making those changes, because we have to get through 7 Democrats in the Senate if we do it, the president ought to make sure that he understands he's got the powers of the executive to do what the Constitution says he can do. And he should go forward and do that to the extent where it's possible to defend the country and to make the right decisions for the betterment of the people. And so we'll see what he does with respect to some of these judges' rulings. But keep in mind, Matt, a lot of these are getting overturned, right? We've had several that have already gotten swatted down by even liberal judges, right? Where a liberal judge made a bad ruling, and then another liberal judge said, hey, dude, you got out of line. So I think if we can let a little time go by, I think a lot of these will get cleaned up because these are judges who are just making political decisions.
Final question for you, Congressman Roy. You've been leading hearings in the subcommittee that you chair in the House Judiciary Committee on the birthright citizenship issue. What can you tell our viewers about where that effort stands?
Yeah, well, first of all, the president did the right thing right out of the gate on day one with his executive order on birthright citizenship. There is no such constitutional protection for illegal aliens or people who are here on a non-permanent basis to have a, quote, birthright citizenship. I think it's even questionable if you're an LPR. But they've been using a 130-year-old judicial opinion by the Supreme Court to say that birthright citizenship is just a right for anybody if you're here illegally, which is patently false. We had 3 very strong lawyers, accomplished lawyers, some who have argued in front of the United States Supreme Court in our hearing yesterday, who made that very clear. Subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and the 14th Amendment is there for a reason. And it was to make sure that, yes, the people who were wrongly being targeted, who had been slaves, they were clearly citizens. That's why that was passed in 1868. But the courts right after that were very clear. It doesn't mean that if you're a foreign national, you come here and you have kids, that they're citizens, because you have an allegiance to the foreign country. It's plain as day. I think the Supreme Court would side with us. I think the president is right. And I tried to have this hearing to back up the president. And I think we did that yesterday. And I hope that he'll win in the courts on that issue.
It was very effective. Congressman Chip Roy of Texas, thanks so much for being in the fight and for joining the program.
Thanks, Matt. God bless.